everyone. Once again, good morning. So before anything else, I would like to introduce first my co-members, Sybil Fajardo, Blesa Mariel Fashol, and yours truly, Kylie D. Gabonales. So in this topic, we are going to tackle about the lesson 8, which is the global city. So the learning outcomes of this study, at the end of this lesson, you should be able to first explain why globalization is a spatial phenomenon. Second, identify the attributes of a global city. And last, analyze how cities serve as engines of globalization. If you had a chance, would you move to New York, Tokyo? How about Sydney? Chances are many of you would like to move to these major cities. And if not, you would probably like to visit them anyway. Some of you might have already traveled to these cities as tourists or temporary residents. Or maybe you have heard stories about them. You may have relatives living there who have described buzzing metropolises with forests of skyscrapers and train lines that zigzag on top of each other. You may likewise have an idea of what these cities look like based on what you have seen in movies or TV. Do you remember when downtown Manhattan in New York was destroyed in a confrontation between the Avengers, like Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, the Hulk, etc., and aliens? Not all people have been to global cities, but most know about them. Their influence extends even to one's imagination. What are these places? Why are they important? And how are they relevant to you? So why study global cities? So far, much of the analysis of globalization in the previous lessons has looked at how ideas of internationalism shape modern world politics. We also examined cultural movements like K-pop and how they spread through media like the internet. What this lesson will emphasize, however, is that globalization is spatial. This statement means two things. First, globalization is spatial because it occurs in physical spaces. You can see it when foreign investments and capital move through a city, and when companies build skyscrapers. People who are working in these businesses or Filipinos working abroad start to purchase or rent high-rise condominium units and better homes. As all of these events happen, more poor people are driven out of the city centers to make way for the new developments. Second, globalization is spatial because what makes it move is the fact that it is based in places. Los Angeles, the home of Hollywood, is where movies are made for global consumption. The main headquarters of Sony is in Tokyo, and from there, the company coordinates the sale of its various electronics goods to branches across the world. In other words, cities act on globalization, and globalization acts on cities. They are the sites as well as the mediums of globalization. Just as the internet enables and shapes global forces, so too those cities. In the years to come, more and more people will experience globalization through cities. In 1950, only 30% of the world lived in urban areas. By 2014, that number increased to 54%, and by 2050, it is expected to reach 66%. This lesson studies globalization through the living environment of a rapidly increasing number of people. So defining the global city. Sociologist Saskia Sassen popularized the term global city in the 1990s. Her criteria for what constitutes a global city were primarily economic. In her work, she initially identified three global cities, which is the New York, London, and Tokyo, all of which are hubs of global finance and capitalism. So the definitions. Saskia Sassen in 1990s, the global city identified in four ways. First, key locations for finance and specialized service, which have replaced manufacturing as the leading economic services. Second, sites of production including the production of innovations in leading industries. Third, highly concentrated command points in the organization of the world economy. And last, markets for the products and innovation produced. They are the homes, for instance, of the world's top stock exchanges where investors buy and sell shares in major corporations. New York has the New York Stock Exchange, or the NYSE. London has the Financial Times Stock Exchange, or FTSE, and Tokyo has the Nikkei. The amount of money traded in these markets is staggering. The value of shares traded in the NYSE, for example, is 19,300 billion, while that of the shares in the Philippine Stock Exchange is only 231.3 billion. The New York Stock Exchange represents the highest concentration of capital in the world. Limiting the discussion of global cities to these three metropolises, however, is proving more and more restrictive. The global economy has changed significantly since Sassin wrote her book, and any account of the economic power of cities today must take note of the latest developments. Recent commentators have expanded the criteria that Sassin used to determine what constitutes a global city. Though it is not as wealthy as New York, movie-making Mecca Los Angeles can now rival the Big Apple's cultural influence. San Francisco must now factor in as another. Other commentators expanded the criteria that Sassin used to determine what constitutes global city. New York is the Big Apple, but Los Angeles has Hollywood, which produce and create movies distributed all over the world, which made New York its rival city. Though it is not wealthy as New York, movie-making Mecca, Los Angeles can now rival the Big Apple's cultural influence. San Francisco as global city, since it is the home or the hub of world internet and services provider that connect people. San Francisco must now factor in as another global city because it is the home of the most powerful internet companies, which are the Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Finally, the growth of Chinese economy has turned cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou into centers of trade and finance. The Chinese government reopened the Shanghai Stock Exchange in late 1990, and since then, it has grown to become the fifth largest stock market in the world. Others consider some cities global simply because they are great places to live in. In Australia, Sydney commands the greatest proportion of capital. However, Melbourne is described as Sydney's rival global city because many magazines and lists have now referred to it as the world's most livable city, a place with good public transportation, a thriving cultural scene, and a relatively easy pace of life.
Indicators for globality. Global cities are centers of economic power, economic opportunities, economic competitive, center of authority, political influence, and center of higher learning and culture. The foremost characteristic of global cities is economic power. Sassens remains correct in saying that economic power largely determines which cities are global. For example, is in New York City. We have the largest stock market in the world, but Tokyo houses the most number of headquarters. Shanghai in China may have a smaller stock market compared to New York and Tokyo, but it plays a critical role in the global economic supply chain ever since China became the manufacturing center of the world. Global cities are also centers for economic opportunities. Make it more attractive to talents from across the world. For example, since 1970s, many of the top IT programmers and engineers from Asia have moved to the San Francisco Bay Area to become some of the key figures in Silicon Valley's technology boom. Silicon Valley is the home of global technology companies such as Apple, Facebook, Google, and etc. Global cities are centers for economic competitiveness. To measure the economic competitiveness of a city, the Economist Intelligence Unit has added other criteria like market size, purchasing power of citizens, size of the middle class, and a potential growth. Global cities are also center of authority, means the state of power. Example for this is the Washington, D.C. may not be as wealthy as New York, but it is the seat of American state power. People around the world know its major landmarks: the White House, the Capitol Building Congress, the Supreme Court, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument. Global cities also be considered centers of political influence. The headquarters of the United Nations is in New York, and that of the European Union is in Brussels. An influential political city near the Philippines is Jakarta, which is not just the capital of Indonesia, but also the location of the main headquarters of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Powerful political hubs exert influence on their own countries as well on the international affairs. Global cities are also center of high learning and culture. A city's intellectual influence is seen through the influence of its publishing industry. For example, the New York Times carries the name New York City, but it is far from being a local newspaper. People read it not just across America, but also all over the world. Another example, many Asian teenagers are moving to cities in Australia because of the leading English language universities there. Can the city of Manila, the Philippine capital, be considered a global city? Manila is not very global because of the dearth of foreign residents. Dearth means lacking or conditions of not having enough for something. The challenges of a global city. Global cities conjure up images of fast-paced, exciting, cosmopolitan lifestyle. But such descriptions are lacking. Global cities also have their undersides. Global cities struggle disproportionately with the pathologies of new economy based on the research of Chicago Council on the Global Affairs. Pathologies means diseases and problems of new economy. This includes inequality, terrorism, pollution, climate change, traffic in drugs, and human beings, the stresses of immigrations. The first challenges of global cities is the size of great inequality and poverty challenges. For example, here in Metro Manila, it's common to see gleaming buildings alongside massive squatter area. Cities can be sustainable because of their density. As Richard Florida notes, ecologists have found that by concentrating their populations in smaller areas, cities and metros decrease human encroachment on natural habitats. Another challenges of global city is environmental degradation. Most often, cities are environmentally unsustainable. Cities process large amount of energy and materials as they scrape different sources of waste. Other challenges of global cities is major cities can be sites of major terror attacks. The targets for terrorists due to their high populations and their role as symbols of globalization. That many terrorists, despite, for example, the 9/11 attacks that brought down the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, and the November 2015 coordinated attacks in Paris by zealots of the Islamic State Iraq and the Levant or ISIL.
I'm Blasa Mariel Fashol, the last reporter from Group 8. My topic for today is all about the global city and the poor. It consistently noted that economic globalization has paved the way for massive inequality. Through this, very pronounced in some cities, the large cities particularly considered is Scandinavia. Scandinavia has found ways to mitigate inequality through stated social redistribution. In places like Mumbai, Jakarta, and Manila are common to find gleaming buildings alongside massive shanty towns. Based on my understanding, and it already summarized about the global city and the poor, yes, as well, global city and urban century that enjoy significant competitive advantages and serve as economic globalization way for massive inequality. So it is also tangible effect on global affairs through socio-economic. The three places are commonly to find a gleaming building alongside massive shanty towns are included Mumbai, Jakarta, and Manila. For example, the global city and the poor. According to the Google, London, New York, Paris, and Tokyo are considered the big four cities. Not coincidentally, they serve as symbols of global capitalism. In Philippines, Metro Manila has become an emerging global city like Seoul, Shanghai, and Jakarta. Explanation. Through globalization serve as guide of global entrepreneurs, the strategic represent all the economy way to change the globalize all the phenomenon. We see the very best effective and impact in socio-economic system. So conclusion. Global cities are sites and medium of globalization. It represents the phenomenon. We see the best result of globalization. They are places that create exciting fusions of culture and ideas. It is also regenerate tremendous wealth. However, they remain sites of great inequality where global servants serve global entrepreneurs. That would be all. Thank you.